In this demo, I'm going to show you how to add a new scope to DHCP. Now, we're going to be doing this on a Windows Server 2016 data center system. And as you can see, it's data center system with the GUI installed. So let's go ahead and let's go on out onto our server and let's open up the Dhcp Manager. So we're going to go to Windows Administrative Tools and we're going to double click on DHCP. Now what we're going to do is we're going to build a brand new scope for IPv4 for that version. So here's the IPv4. As you can see, there are green check boxes next to the servers. This means that this server has been authorized in Active Directory. And another way you can tell is if I click on the server name, right click, you'll see the word unauthorized. If this hadn't been authorized yet, the word authorized would be there, and instead of being green check boxes, you would have two red down arrows. So we know that the system has been authorized in Active Directory, which just means that Active Directory knows that this DHCP server is there. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to click on IPv4. We're going to right click and we're going to say new scope. What we're going to do is we're just going to go through the scope wizard, filling in the fields, and it's going to build the scope for us. So I'm going to go ahead and say next, and it's going to ask you what is the name of this scope. Now this scope is going to be for my 10.10 16.0 subnet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that this is going to be for subnet 16.0. And the description is going to be subnet 10.10 16.0. That is the subnet ID. 16.0 is the subnet ID. So this way I know that these are the IP addresses specifically for the subnet that is 10.10 16.0. So I'm going to go ahead and click next. Now it's going to ask you for the starting and ending address of your pool. Now, the pool is the pool of addresses that can be given out to all of your users. Think of a pool. If you've ever been in the military, you may have heard of the term called a motor pool. What a motor pool is it's a place where you can go when you're military, you can sign out a vehicle, go do whatever you have to do, and then bring the government vehicle back to the motor pool when you're done. Well, believe it or not, the pool of addresses in your scope is the exact same thing. It is a grouping of TCP/IP addresses that will be given out to all of your users, and then when they do a proper shutdown, it will be released back to the pool so that it can be given out to someone else. Now, on a 10.10 16.0 subnet, we can use any IP address from 10.10 16.1 all the way through to 10.10 31.254. Those are all usable addresses for our users. That comes out roughly to about 8,000 addresses. I believe it's 8,094 off the top of my head, but it's around 8,000 addresses. On this subnet, I only have 300 people that are going to be on this subnet. So instead of assigning the entire subnet mask, the entire range of addresses to the pool of addresses, I'm only going to choose enough so that I can handle my 300 users. So what I'm going to end up doing is I am going to start my pool at 10.10 17.1, and I'm going to end my pool with 10.10 19.254. That is going to allow the pool to have all of the 17 addresses, all of the 18 addresses, and the 19 addresses. What that means is 17.1 will be valid, 17.2, 17.3, 17.4, all the way until I get to 17.255. 18.1, 18.2, all the way until I get to 18.255. 19.1, 19.2, all the way until I get to 19.254. Now, technically, I could end this at 19.255, Because the only number that's not valid as a 255 in that range of numbers is 31.255. Remember, when you set up a range of addresses, I'm going to put you out on the whiteboard for a second. Since we're going to be using 255, 240.0, that means my ranges of addresses go by 16s. So my first one goes 0, my next one's 16, my next one's 32, and you just keep adding 16. So my first range of addresses goes from 0.0 to 15.255. My next range of addresses goes from 16.0 to 31.255, because 32.0 starts the next range. Now, when you have a range of addresses in a subnet, you cannot use the first or last address. So I have to start with 0.1 and I can end with 15.254. The first address, this one here, represents the network ID. So 10, 10, 0, 0 is the network ID for that subnet. The last number represents the broadcast. 10, 10, 15.255 is the broadcast for that range of IP addresses. Same with the 16 grouping. I have to start at 16.1 and go to 31.254 because 10, 10, 16.0 is my network ID and 10, 10, 31.255 is my broadcast. So these are the only usable addresses that I can give my users. I'm not starting my pool with 16.1 because what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that my default gateway, which is my router, is going to be the one that I signed 16.1. I have a second router on that same subnet, and that router I'm going to assign 16.254. So those are going to be two of my addresses that I'm going to give to equipment. Plus I have printers, I have other devices that are on that subnet. All of those devices are going to be under the 16 dot whatever number I want to give them. So that's why I'm starting my pool with 17.1. And I'm going to go all the way through to 19.255. And that's going to give me all of the 17 addresses, all of the 18 addresses, and all of the 19 addresses. So that's going to give me about roughly 700, or it's around 780 addresses. So since I only have 300 people on that line, it's going to be more than enough. That's also going to cover in case we're using Cisco phones, in case we're, if they're going to be bringing their own devices. So that's going to be large enough in my pool. So because of that, I'm starting my grouping of addresses at 17.1, and I'm going to end it with 19.255. Now what I have to do is I have to set up my subnet mask to represent the 255, 255, 240.0, this number right here that I showed you. Now I can put in the subnet mask or I can put in the CIDR. The CIDR is the shorthand version of that subnet mask. The CIDR is the number of ones turned on in a subnet mask. So for every 255, you have 8 ones turned on. For every 255, you have 8 ones turned on. 240 has 4 ones turned on. So I can either use 255, 255, 240.0 or show the exact same thing as /20 because 8 plus 8 is 16 plus 4 more ones is /20. So when I'm setting up my scope, I can go either way. I can set this length to be the 20 or I can put in the subnet mask. It doesn't matter which way you go. As soon as you go one way, the other way is going to change. For example, if I change this to 20, you'll see my subnet mask will change. Watch my mask. So I just put 20 on there. 20. I just put 20 on there, and it automatically filled it out to 255, 255, 240.0. Now, if I want, I can put I can make that an 8. Oh. The length doesn't like when you try to do anything under than 8. But as you notice, as soon as I do my length of 8, I'm back to 255. I can also change it in the subnet mask itself. 255, 240.0. Now, when I tab off of this, you'll see this change to a 20. So you can set it either way. You can set the actual mask to 255, 240.0, or you can set the CIDR notation to just /20. Either way works. So I have my grouping of addresses, and I have my subnet mask. Now, when I say next, it's going to ask me, do I want to take any numbers out of that grouping? So I'm using 10, 10, 17.1 all the way through 10, 10, 19.255. Let's say, for example, that the address of 10, 10, 18.100 is already issued to somebody. Somebody actually has that number as a static number, which means it's permanently in their system. What I want to do is, because that number falls between this grouping of numbers, I want to exclude this number from the pool. What an exclusion is I'm saying this is the pool of addresses that I'm going to issue out, but any number that's excluded will be taken out of that pool. It will not be given to anyone. So let's say 18.100 is a number that is already issued. What I would do is, under the starting address, I'd put in 10, 10, 18.100. Now, if I have more addresses, let's say 18.101, 18.102, I can put in a whole grouping of addresses and hit add. But since I only have the one address, once I say add, that number has now been taken out of this pool of addresses. Down here, you'll see where it says Subnet Delay. What this is for is this allows you to put a delay on so that you're not going to immediately send an IP address out to someone when they ask for it. The reason why you may do that is because if you have more than one DHCP server, you may want to have a second one just as a backup. The delay ensures that the primary DHCP server is the first one to send the client an offer. If I go back to our whiteboard, let's say, for example, that this is a router. And on my network, I have two DHCP servers, Dhcp One and Dhcp 2. I want to make sure that Dhcp 1 answers all requests from Subnet 1 first. Dhcp 2 is going to back this Dhcp server up, but as long as Dhcp 1 is up and running, I want all of my users on Subnet 1 to get their address from that server. What I can do is I can put a delay on Dhcp 2 for that subnet, for Subnet 1. This way, I'm guaranteeing that Dhcp 1 is going to have the first opportunity to send an IP address to that subnet. Now, if that box goes down, then Dhcp 2 will handle answering requests from that subnet. But unless that box goes down, I want all of my IP addresses to come from Dhcp 1. So that's the reason why we put a delay in on some scopes, because I want another DHCP server to have the first opportunity to send an IP address. So that's what the delay is. Now, since this is our only DHCP server for this particular range of addresses, I'm not going to touch the delay. So I'm just going to go ahead and say next. And now it's going to ask me what my lease duration is. This is the amount of time that someone is going to be able to continue to use that IP address that I give them. The default is 8 days. The reason the default is 8 days is because you have a 7-day work week. A lot of people come in on Monday, they turn their machine on. When they leave at night, they lock their machine, but they don't shut it down. On Friday, they do a proper shutdown. Come Monday, they turn their machine back on, and they start the whole process over again. By having an 8-day lease, every Monday when they turn the box back on, they're going to try to acquire a brand new lease, a brand new IP address. So by setting it to 8 days, the reason the default is 8 days is because we have a 7-day week. And this way it's going to guarantee that every Monday when the people normally turn their box on, they're going to get a brand new IP address from DHCP. You don't have to keep it at 8 days. If you're running short of IP addresses, where IP addresses, if you don't have a lot for a particular scope, then you might want to set the lease duration only 1 day. This way, every day, everybody tries to get a new IP address. If they get an IP address and they don't properly shut down, come the next day, they're just going to get another IP address. The reason that we worry about this is normally because of laptop users. If a laptop user comes in, gets an IP address for 8 days, and they don't do a proper shutdown, they just shut the lid and walk out, they end up taking that IP address with them for 8 days. Because the only way you release your IP address back to the pool is by doing a proper shutdown. So because of laptop users, and because sometimes they can walk out with one of our addresses, people like to make this lease duration a little less. I got more than enough IP addresses to handle this subnet, even with the few laptop users that I have. So I'm going to leave the default just as 8 days. In this particular environment, there's no reason to change it. So I'm going to go ahead and just say next. Then it's going to ask me, do I want to configure additional options for this scope? Additional options are, for example, who my DNS server is, my default gateways, Wind server if you happen to have one, time servers. These are all of the different things that can be given out at the same time that your users just get an IP address subnet mask. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say no. Don't configure these options. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to show you how to go back in and add options after the scope's been created. So I'm just going to say next. I'm going to say finished, and that's it. My scope has now been created. You'll notice that there is a red down arrow next to the scope. That is because the scope needs to be activated after it's been created. So I would have to right-click on it. I have to right-click on it, and I have to actually tell it to activate the scope if I want this scope to start handing out addresses. Before I do that, though, I want to go in and I want to set up my scope options. Now you'll notice there are two sets of options, scope options and server options. Server options are options that you're going to set up that are going to apply to every single scope that you have. Scope options are options that are scope specific. They are there specifically because they're used for that particular scope only. So for example, if I go back to the whiteboard real quick, let's say that I have a couple routers. Here is my DNS server. Here is my user that's going to get an IP address. When I set up a scope of addresses for this subnet, one of the things that's going to be scope specific is that user's default gateway. The default gateway is just which router are they going to use to get off their subnet. This user, user X, their default gateway can be this side of the router or that side of the router. Doesn't matter. But the router is a scope-specific option. Even if I have 6 or 7 subnets, if I only have one DNS server, I would add DNS as a server option, because that one server would apply to every single subnet that I create. I only have one. So I would make the DNS option a server option, and it would apply to all scopes. So scope-specific options are things that are specific to that subnet. Server options are options like DNS that are going to apply to all of your subnets. So Under my scope option, I'm going to right click, say configure option, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set up my router, my default gateway. And the router for this line is going to be 10.10.16.1. And I'm going to say add. And that's it. It's as simple as that. Now I want to go in and I want to set up my DNS server. I'm going to configure option. I'm going to go to 006. I'm going to choose it. I'm going to put in the IP address for my DNS server. My DNS server happens to be 0.10. So I'm going to say add. It's going to try to find it, and it won't be able to find it because I don't have it running at this time. So it's going to ask me, are you sure that you want to use this IP address because it can't be found? So I'm going to go ahead and just tell it yes once it gives me this little thing right here. See, the IP address is not valid. It is the actual valid DNS address. It's just that server is not up and running at this point. So I'm going to say yes. It is going to be the one that is given out. And then I'm going to say OK. And now I have a server option for DNS. Now watch. When I click on this scope again and click on scope options, you'll see I now have two options. One for the scope and one for DNS. Okay, one for the router here, the default gateway, which is my scope option, and the server option. And it's as simple as that. Now all I need to do is I need to just go in, I need to activate my scope, and at that point, my users for the 16.0 subnet will start getting issued IP addresses. So I hope you've enjoyed this demo on how to set up and configure a DHCP scope.